Hi folks. We all know that hospitals save lives. But it is also the end for those who didn't survive, but where does their spirit goes? Have you ever encountered something creepy on the hospital? Especially when you are alone. So let's start. Here are the 5 creepy haunted stories for you. Story number 1. Anxiety. Rebecca had been suffering from chronic anxiety and depression for years and recently had gone to the hospital to get it treated. Her tiredness and worries had been building up inside of her, and so she decided it was finally time to go to the hospital for help. She hadn't been to the hospital since she was a small child, and it hadn't done her any favors at the time. The halls were still the same, as if time had stopped since then. It was just as cold and frightening as she remembered it, and didn't help her anxiety any. The only doctor at the hospital was Dr. Crane. He was an old man who seemed aware of the atmosphere of the hospital and why it was so eerie. He told Rebecca that the hospital had been the site of a great tragedy many years before, and that the spirits of those who had died there were still present even now. At first, Rebecca thought the doctor was crazy and dismissed his words as the ramblings of an old man. That was until she started to experience things that she couldn't explain. She had seen objects move around in the room, heard voices in the hallways, and strange shadows that seemed to follow her around no matter where she went. One night, Rebecca had a particularly creepy experience on the hospital. She was alone in a certain hallway, and heard the unexplained sound of a baby crying. When she went to investigate, she saw a strange figure in white, hovering in the darkness next to a crib. Rebecca was so terrified that she ran back to her room and locked the door. When Dr. Crane found out what happened, he told Rebecca that it was a spirit, trying to warn her of something. Rebecca was so shook up by this experience that she was quickly released from the hospital. Though she was relieved to be away from the creepy atmosphere, she couldn't shake the feeling that the spirits were still with her, watching her wherever she goes. Since then, Rebecca has become much more aware of the paranormal and takes extra precautions wherever she visits. She carries around herbs and crystals to ward off bad spirits, and explains her experiences to anyone that will listen. It has been years since her creepy experience on the hospital, but the memory of it still stays with her. Story number 2. Luck. John couldn't believe his luck. He had just been accepted into one of the most prestigious medical schools on the East Coast and was absolutely ecstatic about the wonderful opportunities that lay ahead of him. Little did John know that the hospital he would be working at was supposedly haunted by spirits. As time went on, it seemed that many of the medical staff were experiencing strange occurrences, including flickering lights, mysterious whispers, and disembodied footsteps in the hallways. It began as a minor annoyance, but soon those feelings of uneasiness quickly escalated into outright fear as the doctors and other hospital personnel began to tell tales of being chased and tormented by the unseen spirits within. John kept his cool and tried to ignore the rumors, preferring to focus on his studies. But with every passing night, he found it harder and harder to remain skeptical. One night, as John was walking down an empty hallway towards the X-ray room, he heard what sounded like soft weeping and moaning coming from the shadows. Suddenly, the lights around him began to flicker and an icy chill ran down his spine. His heart pounding, he sprinted back to the safety of his room in panic. John was never able to explain nor forget the creepy experience he had endured. For the remainder of his stay at the hospital, he was always extra cautious and often took only the most well-lit of hallways. Eventually, John graduated and left the hospital, never speaking to anyone about the strange occurrences from his time there. To this day, John still wonders if the hospital is still inhabited by spirits, and if so, what happened to the other eager students, the medical staff and the patients who passed in and out of its doors. Could it be that the spirits were simply looking for a way to connect with someone, or were they trying to warn John away from the hospital and the secrets its walls held? Story number 3. Shadow. The sun had just dipped behind the playing fields, casting the Art Deco hospital building in deep shadows. Jan, a junior nurse, had come in the later hours to check up on her patients. With the late-night staff already occupied with their duties, she was the only one left in the pitch-dark hallway. The only sound that could be heard was a low humming, which only served to amplify Jan's fear. As she made her way down the long hallway, something seemed different. The walls had a strange feeling to them, like they were alive, and Jan could feel a chill. Despite her extensive training, Jan was still a young 27-year-old, and her natural instinct was to run away. But even as her heart raced and her throat clenched in terror, something told her to stay a bit longer. So Jan kept walking down the hallway, her feet heavy with dread. At the far end, the hallway opened up into a large room with tall ceilings and looming shadows. Her first thought was to turn around and run, but instead something compelled her to move forward. The room was cold and Jan could feel a presence around her, as if something was watching her from the shadows. Jan's skin prickled and her palms suddenly felt clammy. She closed her eyes, and to her horror heard whispering. It was the voices of spirits, whispering secrets she knew she would never learn. Jan quickly fled the room, her heart pounding. She didn't dare go down that hallway ever again, and soon enough transferred to a different hospital. But to this day she still remembers that night with dread, and the creepy experience she encountered in the hospital, caused by the spirits. Story number 4. Goosebumps. It was a dark and stormy night, but Tina wasn't particularly pleased or scared. She was too busy preparing for her next shift at the hospital. She had worked there for years and had heard some of the stories about how eerily quiet it could be at night. She had been warned to stay away from certain areas of the hospital during the night, but she wasn't the superstitious type. She had heard stories of strange noises coming from the abandoned wing and of doors opening and closing without anyone near them. Tina grabbed her flashlight and headed to the hospital, excited but with a knot of tension in her stomach. She had been assigned to the night shift for the past 2 weeks and had started to get used to the feelings of unease that hung in the air like a heavy fog. When she arrived, the building seemed normal. Everything was in order and all the lights were working. She made her way through the hallways, her footsteps echoing in the otherwise silent corridors. As she worked her way through the building, Tina heard some faint noises coming from the abandoned wing. She didn't pay it any mind and continued on her rounds, growing more uncomfortable by the second. Eventually, she came to a stop in the center of an open common room. Suddenly, a chill raced through her body. She instinctively looked around her, feeling as though she was being watched. To her amazement, she saw figures standing in the shadows, their eyes gleaming in the darkness. Tina froze with terror, unable to even give voice to her fear. She looked around desperately, wanting to flee, but unable to make her feet move. Suddenly, one of the figures stepped forward. It spoke in a hollow voice, "We are the spirits of this hospital, those who have watched its halls for centuries. We are here to remind you that life and death are both part of the cycle of life. Be respectful of both." Tina felt the goosebumps rise on her skin. Despite herself, she was strangely comforted by the spirit's presence. She bowed her head and thanked them for their wisdom before scurrying away, feeling a strange sense of peace as she went. From that night on, She always sensed the presence of those spirits who haunted the hospital, but instead of feeling afraid, she felt a strange sense of security knowing they were watching over her. And for the last story. Story number 5. Just a normal day. Hospitals can be dark and creepy places, especially under the cover of night. As a registered nurse, Ashley had seen some strange things, but nothing prepared her for her experiences on the night shift. It started off normally. Ashley was checking up on a cancer patient in the final days of her battle. Ashley had grown close with the patient and was sad to see her decline rapidly. As she was checking her, something strange happened. One of the monitors started beeping and flashing rapidly. It was only when Ashley stepped away that the monitor returned to its normal functioning, and the patient ceased to exhibit any distress. Thinking it was a fluke, Ashley moved on to her next patient. But strange things start happening again as Ashley enters the next patient's room. The lights start flickering on and off and the sheets on the bed begin shaking violently. Ashley is understandably shaken, but she's never let being scared stop her from doing her job. She steps out of the room and takes a few deep breaths, steeling herself for what's next. As Ashley checks the stairwell, she notices the temperature drop dramatically, as if someone had opened a window in the middle of winter. Ashley quickly decides to quickly return to the patient's room, and she's thankful to find the calm returning there. Feeling a bit shaken up, Ashley decided to take a quick break. But as she enters the cafeteria, she immediately notices something is off. Silence. The cafeteria was usually filled with nurses, patients, and visitors, but this time, it felt ghostly with no one in sight. When Ashley turned to leave, she heard what sounded like laughter coming from the hallway. As she cautiously made her way forward, the laughter abruptly stopped. It was then that Ashley realized what was truly going on. This hospital was haunted. She had heard stories about tragic, untimely deaths that had taken place in the hospital. Spirits were roaming around and haunting the living. Ashley knew things weren't normal here and that it was time for her to take a break from the night shift. Ashley was sure of one thing, however. From now on, she would never take the night shift in the hospital again. All stories ends here. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. Stay tuned to Haunted Stories.